And welcome back to BioFarm 2020, and our final speaker for this evening is Dr. Jim McAdam. And Jim will be speaking to us about agroforestry, the benefit of trees on farms in Ireland. And Jim is an agricultural scientist specialising in agro-environmental measures and in the potential for agroforestry systems to deliver across a range of ecosystems. And as the leader for the Crops, Grassland and Ecology branch of the Agri-Food and Biosciences Institute, Jim has been responsible for research teams in renewable energy, plant breeding and testing, biodiversity and horticulture. And as the AFBI put it, Jim's visionary work on agroforestry over the last 20 years is now increasingly recognised as a key tool for agriculture to support many of our critical environmental challenges, including carbon sequestration and ammonia emissions. Jim's focus is on adapting to land use demands for energy cropping, shifting agriculture from a dominance of livestock production to a more balanced, sustainable farm structure with greater emphasis on crop production than at present. And as if all that wasn't enough, Jim was awarded the OBE, I'm told, in 2014 for his services to science in the Falkland Islands, where he's held, I'm told, in high esteem. We won't put you on the spot about the Falklands tonight, Jim, but I'd like to hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, John. Can everyone see the presentation okay?
Yes, indeed.
It's not okay.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, we can see you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the introduction, John. I know that agroforestry
Jim,
has been mentioned throughout.
Sorry, Jim, just to cut across, we haven't seen your presentation. We're just seeing you at the moment.
Okay, I have it on my screen. I'll have to do screen share, I suppose, wouldn't I? Just a second.
Okay, we're getting close now.
Yeah. Okay.
No, wait.
A bit of it's up anyways.
Small map, Jim.
We have a sliver.
Just go forward to the next slide.
If you can maybe move forward a slide, Jim.
Move forward a slide, okay.
Aha,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great.
Okay.
Yep.
Try.
Go for it.
Yeah. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Good to go.
Perfect.
Good. Thank you. Thanks very much for the introduction, John. It's much appreciated. I know that agroforestry has been mentioned quite a lot of times throughout the conference, and I know that there is a special interest in agroforestry within the sort of biological farming and the organic sector, probably more so than in the conventional farming sector. So in some ways, I suppose I'm preaching to the converted, but I do hope that you all take something away from this talk that's new to what your interest is. And I am especially pleased to be talking at this conference to the group, because I think in agroforestry we're on the cusp really of really selling it as a viable system across a whole range of farming enterprises in Ireland, and I'll mention a bit about that at the end. You can see the logo there. One of those logos is the Irish Agroforestry Forum, which I'll mention just when we finish. Okay, obviously it's pertinent just to think about the current issues which are facing farming and forestry in Ireland. And we know that from a sustainability perspective, Irish agriculture faces challenges across a whole range of areas: water quality, biodiversity, greenhouse gas emissions, tree cover, soil health and soil degradation, as Klaus was telling us, climate change mitigation obligations to meet, air quality, ensuring family farm viability, and giving us access to new markets. All of those are big challenges right across all sectors within farming. And a lot of those really are the result of grassland intensification, which we have had over the last 40, 50 years, which has led us to an agriculture where we are faced with those issues. And really what we're trying to find is to move from these farming systems, such as in the top part of the diagram, where really we're delivering low public goods or low public quality goods, really just almost food production systems, where we want to change our farming systems to those that deliver a high proportion of public goods across carbon adaptation, water, food, access and all. And really the key difference between those two slides probably is there are trees in them to a much greater extent. So that's really where I'm sort of setting the context for agroforestry as we understand it. And really what we mean by agroforestry is the challenge now is to reduce the environmental footprint of farming systems without compromising productivity and to achieve climate resilience, which of course is our big challenge along the way. So an agroforestry is just one potential tool in our armory. I think it's a valuable tool and it's a big tool, and I hope to show you that this evening. What I mean by agroforestry, or to widen it a bit, because in Ireland, our main issues we're concerned with are about pastoral farming. Agroforestry, of course, is worldwide. It's an ancient practice which covers a whole range of ways in which you can integrate agriculture with trees and the environment. But we're mainly concerned with silvopastoral systems, although we will talk about others. But in these, trees are combined with crops and or animals, and the key words are on the same unit of land. Because of course you could have a farm, you could have a woodland, you could even have a forest plant on your farm and have farmland, and that doesn't give you agroforestry. It's really, they have to be integrated on the same unit of land, and that will deliver the range of ecosystem services which result from the significant ecological, environmental and economic interactions between those components. Ecosystem services is a word we hear a lot of, and in terms of selling agroforestry, I've used the term a lot, really. If you just look at a typical agroforest scene, this is a silvopasture on our research farm in County Armagh at Loughgall, where we have probably one of the oldest, about a 30-year-old trial of silvopasture, replicated trial of silvopastoral systems. And throughout the talk, I refer quite a lot to this trial and the outcomes from it, because they do give a strong scientific underpinning to the concepts of agroforestry, because we have evidence over, I say, about a 30-year span. And if we think of concept of ecosystem services, which is really just means what does nature do for us, or what are we getting from the country, any piece of the countryside. And you can see there with a typical silvopastoral system there, we're getting, I think I've listed about 12. There are a lot more if you went into in-depth processes that are ongoing in terms of cycling and so on. But just simply looking at obvious things that come to first sight, you've got really about 12 ecosystem services just jump out at you right away. Whereas if we just had a simple sheep production system, sheep grazing grass, really there's only about 3 or 4 ecosystem services we would get from there. We'd get meat and wool, obviously, plus we would be getting some carbon stored in the soil and fodder produced for the animals to eat. So the difference really in ecosystem services delivery is what we're trying to highlight from our agroforestry system. One of the reasons, of course, we get those ecosystem services is because of the complex nature of the ecosystem. We all know from our basic ecology lectures and everything like that, that the more complex an ecosystem is, the more stable it is, the more less likely it is to suffer from the climate change, the more likely it is to not suffer from drought or from over excess of nutrients being applied from whatever source. If you put a tree into that system, into that grassland system, you introduce a huge level of complexity through all the cycling of nutrients above and other features above and below ground, all of which lead to a system which is much more sustainable and is delivering a much more climate resilient system. Just some examples, these are all from the island of Ireland, of agroforestry systems. As I've said, agroforestry is not widely used or practiced. It's not very well known. We hope that's about to change. There's a group of us that believe it is about to change. And as I say, I'm sure amongst many of the listeners tonight, there's a belief in agroforestry systems that they can deliver across a whole range of scenarios. Primarily, I've always been interested in trying to sell agroforestry as a grassland system to make grasslands more sustainable. And some of these pictures here just give you an example of how agroforestry can be developed into a more sustainable grassland system. But there are wider applications of agroforestry. There in the middle, obviously, poultry systems lend themselves to agroforestry. Bottom left, you have an orchard grazing system, sustainable food production in an agroforestry scenario. Bottom middle there, we have where we have a silvoarable system where we're growing rows of trees and harvesting a crop between that of some sort, and I'll mention that a bit later. So there are a wide range of applications, and there are some examples, not enough. We want to get more demonstration sites and examples on the island where we can promote agroforestry. And as I said earlier, for example, grazing in if you have a simple orchard system, and just by simply grazing that, you can release a whole range of food production objectives, which make it more climate resilient in terms of disease and control and all sorts of other benefits. What I'm going to talk about is really a lot about the benefits from agroforestry, but what is the evidence base that I'm using for that? When I started out on agroforestry research, and that was 30 years ago, about 1989, 1990, there was a group of us in the UK got together to look at ways in which we could get trees introduced onto farms. Now, in those days, really, carbon and climate change was not top of our agenda. Really, our main agenda was we were concerned about grassland intensification, and we were concerned about the need to get trees onto the small farm structure that we had in a lot of parts of the UK. And for example, in Northern Ireland, we had average farm size, 24, 25 hectares. To persuade farmers to plant a hectare of trees, which they would just see as dead wood, that would just be land that was taken out of their farm system, was not proving successful. So we looked around the world at models we could possibly follow to try and integrate trees into farming systems in a more novel way. And one of the things we took seriously interest in was the New Zealand system of agroforestry, as they called it, where they were planting Pinus radiata into sheep pasture and getting a lot of, they were particularly concerned about soil erosion and so on. But we liked the look of that model, and that was really the basis for the model for the research trials that we set up across the UK. And there were 6 sites set up, one of which was in Lochgaw, County Armagh, where we set up an identical trial comparing 3 different systems in 3 replicate plots of each in that trial, where we had pasture with just perennial ryegrass. Then we had a silvopastoral system planted with ash, and I'll talk about that later, and then also woodland planted with ash. And we've stuck to a very strict management protocol, and we followed that through right through all aspects of measuring all aspects of the system. And because we still have that trial in its integrity has been maintained over 30 years, and the plots are still all fenced individually and replicated and so on, we're able to reach conclusions about the benefits of agroforestry. Of all the 6 sites in the UK, ours is the only one that has persisted on for this long, and I believe it's now the longest running replicated silvopastoral trial in Europe. These are just a few shots through the history of development of the site. I say our basis, we took a piece of land, about 18 hectares, and we reseeded the whole lot to start with, so everything was uniform, subdivided it, and then planted the trees. And from the day an hour the trees were planted, we had livestock in with them. Our early concerns were about tree protection, so we set off using the plastic Tubex tubes, the biodegradable, and that was okay, but we've since learnt then, and we've moved on to different forms of protection. That's an aside, almost more looking at the principles. We proved, first of all, that the trees could grow well with ordinary low input grassland, and we proved that animals could grow well, interact with the trees, and get the benefits of animal welfare and of other outputs from the system. The trees grew surprisingly well. You can see there how we did have to put on a secondary form of protection, and we now you do that protection form right from the start until the trees get big enough so the animals don't interact with them. And that was how our just some shots there in the evolution of our trial. The bottom right shot there you can see is when the site was about 19 years old and it had two thinnings. That might appear to be almost a dense canopy cover, yet under that we're still getting about 65 or 70% of grass production. Now we have it 30 years old, if you like, the longest running replicated trial. And that gives a huge opportunity, and that's what I'm going to talk about a good bit. And that's just a picture of the plots a couple of years ago. What sort of benefits, sustainability benefits, have we measured from the system? Well, first of all, in terms of the economic performance, we measured outputs of all components of the system, right through from grass production, from livestock production, from tree growth and tree measurements. We looked at the full details of livestock production. We kept the same animals on each plot right throughout, so we could, lambs that were born on the plots virtually, and then were finished in the plots, we were able to get meat quality, and we got wool quality assessed. And we proved that basically having animals growing in and around trees had no negative connotations whatsoever in terms of meat quality or in terms of wool output or anything like that. Through the cycle of the trees growing, we were able to collect the single farm payment or basic payment because the department regarded the land as the primary use of the land as being agriculture. And we had full livestock output for 12 years below the trees. Of course, the canopy as it grew started to close. All the computer predictions were that by about year 6, 7, 8, maybe you would start to get a decline in grass growth and livestock production. We didn't get that. We found that was up to about 12 years before the canopy closed sufficiently for grass growth to start to decline and livestock production fell a bit. Of course, there was compensation because the animals were benefiting physiologically for being from the shelter and shade that the trees brought to them. So about year 12, we had to make a decision. We had planted 400 trees per hectare, about 5 meter spacings. That was, it was all sort of straight lines and so on. You have to do that in reality. We can mention that later. We made a decision. We then had to make a decision, and that was any groups of farmers we've ever brought to see the site. What they liked about agroforestry or silvopasture was the flexibility that the system offered, because they said, right, you haven't committed yourself totally. You got to year 12. You could look at the market ahead and say, right, there's going to be a great market for carbon or timber, therefore we just let the tree component grow. Or you could say there's going to be a great market for meat production, so we could do some thinning, let the grass pick back up, and let livestock production continue at a reasonable level. And that's what we did. We took year 13, we removed a quarter of the trees, and we sold those where they were ash. Of course, they were good early quality ash, so we got a good capital investment from the site, and that allowed livestock production to creep up. We moved more trees, and we now have about 220 trees per hectare and about 70% of livestock potential compared to the grass plots outside. They also say too that the animals consumed the tree foliage and they ate it well, and that experience from other agroforestry. And near the end of the talk, I'll give you some results from the Organic Research Centre in England on the value of tree foliage to animals. And of course, they had an enhanced welfare environment. But we were concerned with measuring. So in terms of straightforward, as a farming system, it was sellable. The economics were good. Farmers were interested in it. But it was really the environmental benefits which we measured through output, which have now come to be obvious, to be so critical to actually giving agroforestry a real role on farms in Ireland. So I'll talk about these in a bit of detail, but Obviously, in terms of climate resilience, weather modifications are important, reduced evapotranspiration, increased biodiversity, improved soil nutrient status and recycling, improved soil carbon content, reduction in emissions, and water permeability through the soil profile, which leads to sort of compacted grassland having a much more healthy soil and a much more friable soil. Thinking of resilience to extremes of weather, as we know from climate change predictions for Ireland, rainfall is expected to become more intense. We're going to get more severe blasts of rainfall. And what we've found is, we've proved, and this is one of the values in having such a long-term trial, we were able to, and I think it was in about year 26 or so, we were able to look right down through the profile of soil using a soil penetrologer, which basically is a spike you push down, an electronic spike you push down through the ground, which gives you a measure of resistance and a measure of soil porosity. And we found that that's just the average results there on the left. The lighter, the outer bars are the agroforestry plots, and the darker one are for the grass only plots. And we found right down to 76 centimeters in depth, and that was a highly significant result, that there was soil porosity was much greater under the agroforestry. And what that meant was we were able to have an extended grazing under agroforestry, and we measured that to be something like 13 to 17 weeks later. I'll just flick to the next slide just to show that. And this is very important, because one of our recent concerns, obviously, is grass utilization and ammonia release from animals. And the longer that animals are housed, the more ammonia they're going to release. So the longer you can keep them out on pasture, you're going to significantly reduce ammonia, as well as having impacts on animal health and possibly N2O emission as well, because the soil is drier. Over the winter, for example, of 16-17 and 17-18, we measured the soil moisture content from the two sets of plots, and the top, the blue line, is the soil moisture profile from the grassland plots. This is over winter, and these are the soil moisture content, the bottom line, from the agroforestry plots. And if we take, say, a 40% soil moisture content as a cutoff to when you shouldn't really have animals out, because you're going to do a lot of poaching damage, you can see on the agroforestry plots, we were able to keep animals in over the winter of 16-17 for 17 weeks longer. And we've done that over 3 winters now, and found an average of about 15 weeks that animals could be kept out longer. Now, I know we're not saying that everyone would have a agroforestry on all of their farm, but if you even had 10-20% of a farm in agroforestry, and you saved that ground for autumn grazing, for example, you could end up keeping your animals out for a couple of months longer, and maybe even get them on a month earlier in spring. And that has great impact on levels of grass utilization. It reduces ammonia emissions, and it improves animal health, and increases the resilience to flash flooding, and just improves the overall biological soil health. We know how important resilience to weather extremes are going to be. These two graphs here are just taken from the Farmers Journal, looking at the sort of the resilience to drought, which we are starting to find more and more in Ireland is going to become a key issue in farming systems. The top left graph there, all of us remember the 2018 summer, when July and August, really, we had such dry, hot conditions. And the dotted black bar are the 10-year averages for grass growth in Ireland. The red line is the summer of 2018 profile for grass growth. And you can see that during the month of July and a good bit of August, grass growth practically stopped in Ireland. And that had huge consequences for our farming systems. It led to fodder crisis in the winter. It led to animals having to be taken in early off pasture. And it really had a major impact And we might think, oh, that's just a one-off, that was a severe winter. But if you look at the last 2 years as well, 2019, 2020, both those years, our spring grass growth profiles have been well below the 10-year average, up to 20% below. You can see there, that's spring. So that's a critical thing that's been happening. And what people then said to me, how did your agroforestry trees perform during 2018? I suppose you had, no grass growth at all because the ground was so dry. But to the contrary, actually, although we weren't, because we didn't have research funding at that time, but we still had the plots, we were able to able to observe that grass still stayed fairly green and fresh under the trees compared to outside the trees. And I would attribute that to really wide-spaced trees reducing the wind speed and reducing the evapotranspiration out of the ground and letting the soil and letting the moisture go into the trees. In terms of other weather extremes, we're obviously going to get more frequent storminess. That's been a pattern of our climate change. And we know that densely planted trees with interlocked roots are much more vulnerable to large-scale wind throw than wide-spaced trees are in an agroforestry type scenario. So silvipastoral systems are more resilient to weather extremes, and that will have a positive impact on animal welfare and crop performance. Wildfires are another. Foresters particularly are increasingly concerned about changes in weather and patterns combined with an increased fuel loading below the trees increases the risk of wildfires. The forester manages agroforests, that is introducing grazing, for example, that would reduce the understory fuel loading as well as giving an additional crop, and at the same time would let the trees grow, and you would be the landowner would be having additional benefit from both. It's widely practiced now in northern Spain and Galicia, for example. Horses graze between the trees there, used to reduce fire risk in forests. Because our trial site is also part of the university, I was able to get access over many years of cheap labour, which are MSc and PhD students. I know that any that are listening will be cringing. I think we're not supposed to be cheap labour, but they are, of course, whenever you're trying to get funding for research, and it also gives them the benefit of feeling that projects they're involved in are worthwhile and have got a future. So we've been able to measure over the history of the trial, the early years in particular, a lot of the impact on biodiversity. And in the three graphs there, the left one is the grassland, the middle one is the agroforestry, and the right one there is the ash woodland. And if we looked at number of spiders, birds, beetles, in all of those, the agroforestry outperformed the other systems. And we measured significantly more earthworms, particularly young earthworms in agroforestry. It had an impact on the flora. And there's been a recent paper published looking at agroforestry systems across the whole of Europe, which proves definitely that the number of pollinators is much greater in agroforestry systems than in other systems. So we really, I think, were able to show that silvipastoral systems were environmentally sustainable and delivering a range of ecosystem services. In Northern Ireland, we have a big concern over high phosphate level in our soils and high ammonia levels as well. And using natural solutions, tree-based solutions, trees will remove phosphate from the ground in those scenarios. They will help reduce ammonia emissions. So it gives an opportunity to target grassland systems which can be more sustainable. In more recent years, there's been a big interest in carbon content. So we were able to, by about year 24, I think, we measured the total carbon in the woody biomass of our agroforestry trees, and we measured them at 77 tons. That had been over the life of the trees. Obviously, in the early years, you're not getting the same level of sequestration, but what we have estimated that over, typically at the minute, we're getting annual carbon sequestration rates of about 2.4 tons of carbon per hectare per year. And very importantly, the soil carbon pools stored in the ash silvipasture is on smaller soil particles than in the other systems, and that carbon pool is be more resilient to environmental change. In other words, it's less likely to be oxidized than in pasture alone. If you add, we've got a grass sward below that is fixing about 0.8 tons or sequestering about 0.8 tons of carbon per hectare per year. So we estimate from our silvopasture, the trees plus our understory sward are sequestering around 3.2 tons carbon per hectare per year. And the average beef system in Ireland is emitting about 4 tons carbon per hectare per year. So by integrating agroforestry at a level and using your hedges and trees, you could start to approach zero carbon. Soil health, there's a lot of evidence worldwide for the benefits agroforestry brings to soil health. Soil physical structure is improved, the porosity, it gives you more earthworms and more soil biota. Soil organic matter, carbon and particulate matter is very important. Graphs to show the middle bar once again is the silvopasture, where there's more, that's soil carbon. The top is the top 10 centimeters. The next is the bottom 20 to the bottom 10 centimeters. So we're getting more carbon being stored on small particles, which makes them more recalcitrant. There's a lot of research done on mycorrhizal fungi in agroforestry systems, very beneficial. And with the understory component of agroforestry, we have an opportunity there to deliver more nutritious carbon sequestering fodder. And that's an aspect of silvopasture that we really could develop a lot more. We tend to have done a lot of work on trees and grass growing and concentrated on those elements without maybe realizing that we could do far more manipulation of the understory forage and herbage, which could have different rooting rates, which could respond better to the soil environment created by the trees. We know really the ultimate dilemma we have here for grass-based ruminant agriculture in Ireland is to try and recognize that grassland can sequester greenhouse gases as well as emit them. And once again, the key to that is trees, is putting woody species or trees into that system. And trees can be incorporated into farms in a range of scenarios. In silvopasture, as we've seen, we know that hedges contain large quantities of stored carbon, and they sequester large amounts of CO2 from the atmosphere annually. We must also accept, of course, that some compromise in productivity must be achieved at the expense of ecosystem services delivery. But these ecosystem services are public goods. They're essential. Clean water, carbon sequestration, they're all goods that we need if we're going to meet our obligations and develop climate resilient systems. Just sort of finishing up now a bit on more practical matters about establishing agroforestry. If we can establish agroforestry by several ways, first of all, even using existing forests, those could be respaced by thinning, and then an undersown crop, an understory crop sown and trampled in, the seed trampled in by animals, or using existing woodland or scrubland. All those can create a silvopastoral system based on an existing forest or woodland. Or if we, as we want to do in many scenarios, to establish directly into a grassland system, then there are ways of, depending on whether we use sheep or cattle, whether using livestock. The bottom right picture, for example, is a 12-year-old silvopastoral site, which is the oldest, I think, in Ireland, in the Republic of Ireland. That's near Clonakilty, where you have ash once again. Come back to the point about ash. I mean, okay, our site we planted with ash 30 years ago, and even Liam Beechener's site was planted with ash 12 years ago. We didn't know a thing about ash dye back then, and most of our trees are going to go, I suspect. But I'm not too dismayed because we've had 30 years of experience, and from that, we've proven, I think, that the system works. And we should really maybe take some of those ash crops and use those as a means of establishing silvopasture by interplanting the ash as they die off with other species, and gradually, with continuous cover, developing a silvopastoral system. Then secondly, establishing silvopasture. We aim to plant a mixture of species to suit the site, to deliver a range of environmental benefits, and to give you resilience. There's no need to think about. We know that mixtures are the most resilient. They give you more resilience against climate, against disease, and all sorts of things. And they give you an opportunity, for example, of fruit and nut trees and a whole range of systems, not just, think of horticultural systems, arable systems. We're not just thinking of pastoral systems. And plant in a configuration to suit your farming system. For example, you don't have to plant in straight rows and square lines. We did because it was a research site. For example, there's an opportunity to use contour planting, to use rows, wider rows if you want to cut grass or crop in between, or plant in clumps. And consider mixing systems. For example, we had an area of silvo-arable land, which I said we planted about a hectare of wide space poplar at our site in Loughgall. And for 6 years between that, we grew a barley crop. We didn't have to protect the trees because we had sown a clover underlay along the rows of the trees, and that encouraged much more ladybirds and other birds, which University of Leeds students proved that you were able to reduce your pesticide input to maintain the quality of the crop. Then we decided to convert that to just to silvopasture, so we grassed it down. On the intervening, I did look around for another use to those trees, and a nearby vegetable grower did come to me with the prospect of planting leeks between the trees. He had seen that done in other places. He didn't actually, at the end of the day, it fell through the idea because of other things he had done. But there's no reason why you cannot have a vegetable enterprise or integrate agroforestry with a wide range of species or a wide range of farming systems. We then grassed our poplar down to create a silvopasture where we've had no issues with tree protection, obviously, and we now have a fairly mature crop. Just to finish too, remember the forage value of the foliage. Animals eat twigs and eat leaves, and that reduces their methane emissions, which is very important. We're looking at ways of trying to reduce the emissions from agriculture. There's also some good research done by the Organic Research Centre in England with Joe Smith and Sally Westaway, looking at the value of tree fodder, the chemical composition of tree fodder to animals. And there they have looked at the leaves, and they looked at willow, alder, ash, goat willow, and elm, and they've sampled various times throughout the year and so on. Really, I've just taken their tables straight out rather than transcribe them. But if you look at the right-hand figures are the digestible organic matter. That really, it just gives a measure how edible the trees are. Well, at those times, for most of those species, if we get a digestible organic matter from good grass, is up in the 65, 70%, early 70%. So those leaves are all come out as perfectly digestible, perfectly edible. Then if you look at some of the macro elements you were getting in the trees, you can see across there, right, a wide range of macro elements. But I've just put in a comparison with grass, fresh grass, with grass silage, and with hay for phosphate. Phosphate's an important mineral for bone development and so on. And you can see, looking down through the species, willow, alder, and so on, you're getting levels of 3, 4, 5 grams per kilogram of that nutrient, which are even above, in many cases, the grass crop, but are certainly holding their own in terms. And then just finally looking at the micro elements, a good range here. Particularly, I've highlighted Salix viminalis, the osier willow, really high levels of things like zinc, manganese, boron, elements which are very important for plant and animal health and growth in a more biodynamic system. And all of those tree leaves, are showing some very healthy nutrient levels, which makes them important. So to summary, really, what are the proven benefits we've had from silvopasture? It's found to extend the grazing season, gives us higher grass utilisation, resilience to grazing during extreme rainfall and drought, reduces emissions. It increases biodiversity, increases carbon sequestration, reduces water runoff, provides a renewable fuel, improves soil health, enhances animal welfare and nutrition, and it can be economically viable and can help sustain a traditional farm structure and rural economy. You have the opportunity to grow good trees in silvopasture as well. And if you tend to select the right tree species and look after them well, you can have a really valuable timber crop from your silvopasture at the end of the day. So by integrating trees into farms in a range of spatial options, we can deliver carbon neutral farming systems. We can reduce greenhouse gas emissions and improve soil health and so on. And all of those are very climate positive measures. In terms of just a final word on support, agroforestry can be part of an environmental. At the minute, agroforestry is supported under a forestry measure in Ireland, and that in a way is a problem. And in the north, it's supported under an agriculture measure, which, you know, there's issues there too. So we really need to, looking ahead, think of how agroforestry can be supported as an environmental, farming or forestry measure, because the climate objectives are the same, and it's a very flexible form of land use, which is delivering a wide range of ecosystem services. I'll just finish with a mention of the Irish Agroforestry Forum. In recent months, really, or this year, there's been a big awakening of interest in agroforestry. I think it's because the whole climate agenda the whole climate issue has come high up the agenda. There's a lot of political interest in agroforestry. So a group of us have been getting together for some time, sometime over this year, to try and pull together our expertise and try and answer the queries we're getting and satisfy people's and look at ways we can help promote agroforestry. And we've just recently formed what I call the Irish Agroforestry Forum, which means to be as inclusive as possible. And we've produced a policy paper, if you like, or position paper on the way that we see agroforestry going in Ireland. And if you want that copy of that paper and more details about the Agroforestry Forum, those are available from NOTS themselves. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope you did find that of interest. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim. I think it was a terrific presentation and a great way to finish what's been a busy day indeed. And also we have lots of questions in. I'm not surprised. I think it's probably fair to say that the relationship between agriculture and forestry in Ireland in recent years has been strained, to put it mildly. So I think what Jim is presenting is a different vision, agroforestry, integration rather than replacement. And I think it's a fascinating way of reimagining our relationship with forestry and trees. As I say, instead of seeing them as a replacement for farming, seeing them as a part of a portfolio or part of a patchwork that makes up for a modern farm, if you like. So I'll go first to Keely, who asked the question, Jim, what do you see as the main reasons agroforestry hasn't been taken up by more farms across Ireland to date?
Okay, well, I think if you look back to when we started off, one of the reasons was just farmers' vision of it was anything to do with forestry was taking land out of their production. And maybe having the word forestry in the title is not good, because farmers now have a mental association with forestry as being, in certain scenarios, being not good, as an antithesis to farming. So I think we have a communication effort to do to try and educate on what agroforestry is, or really silvopasture, trees on pasture, using trees in as novel way as possible. So I think we have to get over that hurdle. One of the ways we can do that is through having more demonstration sites, or as having more research, having more promotion. Because I think now it has come to be seen as a win-win situation. Particularly when you read through the farming press, you'll see agroforestry is now being mentioned more and more, or the role that trees can play on farms. And it's trying to move away from it being just a forestry system or a farming system or an environmental system. But people might approach it from either of those ways. Therefore, if the government if the next move was in the government's hands to actually say, look, we will have an environmental support measure, including agroforestry, a forestry support, and a farming support measure. That way, farmers will see that it fits a wider range of scenarios and can, play in horticulture, arab tillage, and grass sectors.
Yeah, you mentioned as well the carbon agenda, if you like, and what we've seen, recent data produced in the Republic shows that in fact our forestry sector is currently a net emitter of carbon. So that tells you that one of the things we had hoped that forestry would, like this is industrial forestry, would contribute. In fact, that's not working either. So I would hope, and maybe I put it to you, that maybe that's rather than seeing it as a negative, maybe that's a window to reimagine forestry, and agroforestry might fit that bill.
Yeah, although that headline that came out, I don't think, it belied a lot of, there's a lot of types of forestry, and in many cases, a lot of it is sequestering carbon and is valuable. But I think looking at from a farm perspective, or a whole farm perspective, the role that trees can provide on that farm, the role that trees in our hedges, trees spaced through the farm, if you look at a whole farm basis, and if you start to add up what your trees can do, and carbon perspective, then you can start to come much more towards a carbon neutral system. We reckon there's a young lad at UCD did an interesting project. We looked at 5 or 6 farms to see what percentage of those, these were stock farms mainly, what percentage of their land would need to be in silvopasture to achieve carbon neutrality for a good beef production system. And he found it was about 26% of the farm. If you had silvopasture integrated into that, you would have a carbon neutral beef system. That's reasonable, that's achievable. I'm not saying every farm would do that, but if you even set targets of 20% for silvopasture, you wouldn't be getting a significant reduction in production, and yet you'd be delivering a much more carbon friendly system.
Sure. And that argument might be a lot more compelling if farmers were rewarded for and penalised for systems depending on their carbon efficiency, which really isn't the case at the moment. We know it sectors, but individual farms are making decisions and they don't have to apply a carbon filter yet. I'll move on, Jim. Pádraig asked a question which I think you've really touched on, but I'll put it out there anyway. He asked, would you consider hedgerows as agroforestry? And could hedgerow enhancement achieve many of the ecosystem improvements that you're describing?
I don't tend to consider hedgerows agroforestry. Oh, there are trees and hedges, which, if you like, they're the start of an. I would say if you had expanded those hedgerows out with wide-spaced trees, I would try not just brand them as agroforestry or not agroforestry, because it's looking at the whole farm landscape and saying, yes, hedgerows have got woody plants in them that are storing carbon, and we need to include them in the equation when we're looking at the carbon pool on the farm. But I would say that agroforestry then is widening the concept of the hedgerow out into the field or the crop itself and getting the trees out there. So don't forget the soil health benefits are a big thing from agroforestry. So, under your hedgerow, you have an intensity of trees which lead to a certain soil type. But if you want to get really soil health improved on a wider scale, then you want to be planting trees out into the middle of your agricultural systems, where the tree roots have got a big volume to exploit and are doing all those benefits that we know to making soil more less degradable and healthy.
Yeah, that's going to take probably a mindset change. That I could see quite a bit of resistance to that, and some of the questions that I have coming in kind of reflect that. Brian McGee asked the question. He said, "Would grass quality reduce due to poor sunlight and moisture intake going into the soil?"
That's a very good question. I think if you start on your basis, we want to try and grow perennial ryegrass, single monoculture perennial ryegrass, high intensity. Yes, we did find that the ryegrass was much more resilient. When we got up to about 12 years old and our grass yield had dropped off to 70%, it wasn't that the ryegrass had been replaced by weed grasses. It was just more that the shade effect was having an effect. But now I think we're having a completely new look at the understory pasture. There's a lot of research going on, for example, at the lands at Douth, where there's research trials on looking at the understory for agriculture, using mixed species swards, using using legumes in the sward, using herb species in the sward. Those plants all root at different depths. They're much more resilient and tolerant. And I think in a silvopasture, we should move. But having said that as well, some of the grass companies I know are looking at breeding more shade-tolerant grasses that will be more productive under shade. So I wouldn't see it as a drawback. I think, it could be exploited as a benefit potential of the system.
Fair enough. Roisin asks, are there issues around animals eating the bark of trees and damaging them?
Yes, that was our first problem we had because we had a sheep. We established our system with sheep, and as the sheep, once the trees had grown big enough and were strong enough, we thought that's great. We're through the stage of having to protect the trees, but once we removed the tree guards, then the animals did nibble the bark. Okay, two ways of tackling that. That we realise now that we were using a set stock system because we wanted to measure the performance of those animals' lifetime performance on the plot or seasonal performance. And therefore, when the animals were on a set stock basis, they didn't do any damage to the trees until they'd been there a couple of months. So then later we moved to a rotational grazing system where you let the grass grow up, put the animals, a large batch of animals in, let them graze it down and then move them around or rotate them. We didn't have anything like the same bark grazing damage. And when we later moved to use cattle, we didn't really have any problem with bark nibbling. The problem with the cattle was you need to get the trees up to be firm enough to withstand rubbing, and that's a separate challenge. But it's a good, the bark solution, I think, with grazing management, you can overcome that.
At what age, Jim, would the trees need to be, how mature would they need to be before you have to stop actually sealing them off or guarding them off? Are we talking about 20 or 30?
No, about 5 or 6 years.
As young as that,
yeah. We put young dairy heifers in after, I think, year 7, between year 7. After year 7, the trees were strong enough.
Okay, they can withstand it at that stage. Fair enough. Now, there's another question about grass quality and silvopasture, but I think you've addressed that. So I'll move on to Danny Fanning, and he asks, will the livestock eat the grass underneath the trees? It seems to make the grass sour on my farm.
Okay, interesting observation. We found, I had a researcher who looked at the behaviour of the animals in agriculture, and she proved that the animals spent significantly more time under the trees when it was strong sunshine or when it was rain and windy, as you would sort of expect. That meant there was more dung and urine under the trees. That meant there was more trampling under the trees in certain scenarios. That may have contributed to rejection, but overall, I didn't find that was the case. But I'm interested in the observation.
Yeah.
And pump it up.
Your counter-observation is that it may in fact be to do with the altered behaviour of animals around trees rather than the tree affecting the grass. That's interesting. Okay. Darry McGovern says he has a question for Jim. He said, has the introduction of trees reduced rushes?
Yeah, well, that site was a good site. It wasn't rushes. I've seen a couple of trials in Fermanagh now where the ground is where they have had trees, and it has helped reduce rushes. Yes. One of the things we have, because we have very few examples of agroforestry, for about 3 years now, we've had a scheme in the north, the environmental farming scheme, which there is an agroforestry option in the wider scheme, and we've had about, I think there's 40 farms or something have taken up an agroforestry option there within that. And some of those are in the west of the province, are in the wetter areas. So we're sort of keeping an eye on those farmers. And that now gives us, if you like, a group of farmers where we can follow up more closely what effect silvopasture will have on some of those wetter pastures. But I would expect it would reduce rush and growth as you gradually dry out the trees.
Okay, and just an observation of my own. You mentioned early in your presentation, you used the phrase that complexity equals stability. And I thought it was very interesting, if you like, as a take-home for your presentation this evening, that it's putting complexity back into the system. If farmers can grasp that and run with it, that what we're doing then presumably is reintroducing complexity from which flows stability and from which presumably also flows resilience. Is that how you see it?
Exactly, yes. If you take an example, say a cereal crop, a barley crop, where you sow a variety and every individual is genetically identical in that. If you get a disease comes in or something, your whole ecosystem will collapse unless you do something about it, unless you spray it or control it some way or other. So that's an unstable system, and it's very easy to topple that system off. Whereas if you have a system that's much more diverse and you have a whole range of plants and a whole range of structures, if you get a drought or if you get a disease coming in, one is affected a bit and the others quickly fill the space, and your system therefore remains stable and resilient. And I think that people are coming to realise that more and more, particularly in terms of climate resilience.
Yeah, and I guess variety gives you a firewall against disaster as well. You haven't, I think as Fiona said in the previous speech, you're not putting all your eggs in one metaphorical basket. Yeah, I'll come back to the questions, Jim, if I may. We're galloping towards the finishing line. Lucy Tottenham asks, would you recommend a mix of broadleaf and conifers, i.e. mixed species, or do you recommend one tree species? Because we did notice that the earlier images that you showed of the interspaced trees, they did appear to be all the one species. So what's your thinking on that?
Yeah, I say that was a research trial, so we used ash because we all picked a species which grew. We also picked a tree species which grew best on our sites across the UK, and in Ireland, ash did well. And come back to the point that was 30 years ago. And now ash is gone. But we've got other trees. We've got some trials with wild cherry, which are looking really promising. And you could. The secret is match your tree to your site. If you have a wet, heavy soil, alder, willow, species like that, birch, by all means, mix your species, but mix your species to suit the site. And the more mixed you have, the better. Yes, I've seen conifers, larch. I've seen some in Scotland, Scotch pine and larch. I've seen those in silvopastoral systems. They do perfectly well. I think the secret is just getting a tree that'll grow well on the site. Some trees like beech and so on don't seem to do well when they're protected in the early years and they're slow. But oak, ash, sycamore, cherry, they all seem to grow well.
Okay. Peter Kelleher has an interesting one here. He asks, can grass survive the winter covering of leaves? So obviously as the trees shed their leaves, say in the middle of a field, will it not mulch the grass and destroy it? Well,
in most cases you find animals eat. If you're grazing right through into the autumn, we found the animals just voraciously ate the fodder as the leaves came down. They were just eating them. And now there are some trees that not so good in that. When you saw at the end those graphs, which are the figures which showed that the fodder had good nutritional value. Ash was good; they ate them up. Sycamore, well, it's a lot of sycamore has pros and cons, but I think it's a tree that grows in a lot of scenarios, so it's got potential. But the leaves can be messy. But you're not talking about trees at a density like a forest where you have maybe over 1,000 trees per hectare. We're down to about 200, 300 trees per hectare. So you don't have a huge density of foliage.
So it's not sufficient to form a continuous mulch that's likely to actually... I understand. That makes sense. So Matt asks the question, have any trials been done on this agroforestry technique on heavier or boggy soils?
Yeah, that's a point that I was making earlier about now we have sites in Fermanagh, particularly. Yes, there are some examples in Scotland I've seen and in the north. We did some on a hill farm in County Antrim on a peatier soil. It's done okay, it's done perfectly well. And as long as you match the tree to the site, we wouldn't recommend, you shouldn't plant on peat, obviously, because peat lands, planting trees on them is the worst thing you can do in terms of carbon storage and sequestration and so on. It's not permitted anyway. So, but on heavier ground, if you choose the right tree species, they're good for it.
Yeah, okay. Now the final question, Jim, comes from Shawnee G. And he asks, what are the rules around mandatory replanting with agroforestry? And I know a tiny bit about this myself, that it seems planting a forest requires planning permission, and even removing a forest requires planning permission. What happens, how do you know how the rules, now again, you're speaking for Northern Ireland, how do the rules work if you want to, say, interplant agroforestry style, low density? Are you facing the same kind of legal hurdles that have to be jumped through versus a full transfer to your land to forestry?
Well, okay, let's take this from 2 points of view. The first one, from the legal point of view, both forestries, both support measures really give you 5 years support, so there's nothing in the north. It's only a 5 year. There's no indication the grant will be extended beyond that. Likewise, the forestry measure in the south, you're only getting support for on a 5 year basis, yet your land is reclassified as forestry. So technically, there's no protection for the trees after that. So from a legalistic point of view, I don't think there's anything you could do to stop people taking out the trees. But what I would say, if someone is committed to agroforestry, I would never see agroforestry as a clear fail scenario. I would say as the trees mature and you gradually remove them, you would interplant. So you're going to end up with mixed age, mixed canopy, mixed species, and you're going to have a continuous cover at a level which allows you to grow an understory, a grass crop or a cereal crop or whatever, and you would not be thinking of a clear fail scenario. One of the advantages, in those, when we remove the trees, as I said, we cut them off, and then you do get a bit of resprouting, but the animals graze that immediately, so the stumps rot away, so we've never had to remove a stump or anything. We end up still with a continuous grass sward, which has got no... the main point is I wouldn't envisage a clear fail scenario. Agroforestry is giving you a continuous cover.
Okay, terrific. And that seems like a very good note to finish up on, Jim.
I have about 5 questions.
Oh, and hang on, I spoke too soon. Sean wants to add a few more questions.
Jim, thanks a million. Great presentation, Jim. And a couple of things. First of all, I suppose, just to wrap up on a few of the things, one of the other flaws, I think, in why agroforestry has not worked in the Republic of Ireland was what you mentioned there on the scheme. It got dedicated as forestry land. So no matter what happened in perpetuity, that land was always out of agricultural land. And so no direct payments, for example, GLAS schemes, or could be held on that land. So that's part of our proposal in this agroforestry forum, that we would move it to a more agricultural focus, and that the payments would follow the trees. So it wasn't over a 5 year plan, but it would follow the trees. And it just seems, and a results-based system. So that was one thing. The second thing, in my opinion, and I suppose it's just, but I've been looking at agroforestry for a long, long time now, is we've gone through 4 days of biological agriculture. And to me, the icing on the cake in the whole biological story is the adding of trees to the system. And I would like your opinion on this. I don't know if you've seen Christine Jones' talk earlier today, where the issue with the citrus plants. Would it be, in your opinion, a good idea maybe from Klaus Lattenberger mentioned yesterday, was that we're going to lose potentially 300 million ash trees. But maybe we need to be looking at is a research project where we use biological approaches the same way as that citrus in America was done, plant, to see could we get by could trees live to cope with ash dieback?
You mean ash trees or a range of trees?
Ash trees, as in...
Yeah, okay, well, there was a reese, and this is sort of, whenever dieback came out, I had a theory, if you like, that because as dieback, the disease is spread through the leaves fall on the ground in the autumn, then the fungi produce the spores on the overwintering litter on the ground. But we found that on our agroforestry, of course, as soon as the leaves fell, the animals were eating them. So you had a clean bed below that. Now, I don't think it'll prevent dieback. The trees will eventually get it, but I think it'll defray it for quite a long time. You know, if you keep cleaning up below them. But and I think I touched on earlier, maybe those those ash plantations, of which are an awful lot of them, we should now see those as gradually changing those into agroforestry. You know, by interplanting, as the ash trees die, remove them and interplant through. But to come back to what Christine was talking about too, just as a biological husbandry system, I think that's the novel that's the mindset we have to grow from people that, if we're going to have plant systems which are biologically stable and so on, trees have to be a part of those systems because of the huge effect they can have on soil and soil quality. Nearly all our crops, we're just talking about the top 10, 15, 20 centimetres of soil. The soil volume we have over this island is immense if we go below that. And trees help us bring that into play, if you like. They tend to integrate that with the crop that we have and trying to bring a lot of those biological benefits to it. So I think they have a tremendous role. Try not to see it as introducing forestry, but introducing trees in a very wide range of scenarios, and that's the research that needs to be done. What would be the interaction between different crops and different types of trees, between different animals, different types of trees, and how can we make our trees more valuable, because they are a valuable asset as well if we're properly managed. I think there's a whole range of options out there, but the fundamental thing is the soil. At the end of the day, is you're trying to get a healthy soil which stores carbon and which it delivers a lot of the answers that we need for the future.
And it's interesting you made the point about picking the right trees for the right place. I was just informed there 2 hours ago that there's some Sitka spruce on the top of a hill in Leitrim that is moving after all the rain down the hills at the moment as we speak. They're literally sliding down the hills. So it is a testament to the idea that we need to pick the right trees for the right place. One other question I had, Jim, was, and I actually sent you a video of this a while back, was of an orchard. And maybe one of the opportunities, particularly in maybe the southern part of the country, where things like organic fruit juices or something, or fruit juices are an option now as a farm on that Z space or over the ground and have sheep or cattle or whatever running underneath it. But I showed it to a friend of mine, and the first thing he said to me was there was 300 apple trees in it. Is there a risk of disease? You mentioned, I suppose, in a way, but there. And can you, if you want to focus on, we'll say, making apple juice, is it enough to diverse the varieties of apples in that, we'll say, agroforestry fruit plantation, or should it be mixed more with other trees? And I suppose the farmer was probably trying to maximise his potential income while managing it in an agroforestry situation. But is there a risk, do you think, if it's all apple trees, regardless of variety? I suppose that would be kind of my question.
No, I don't. I mean, if anyone wants to grow orchard apple trees seriously, and where we are in Loughgall, it's obviously the heart of apple growing country in the north. I mean, if you look at any orchard, there's a lot of wasted ground below it, which it's just a nuisance, the grass. The farmers have to control it and take it away. We had a little trial at Loughgall where we looked at once again, we looked at the effect of the sheep. We grazed sheep in the autumn when the leaves fell, because apple scab is a huge problem, huge disease problem, and has to be sprayed for continuously, particularly with the bramleys that are grown there. And we found that the sheep removed the apple, the leaves, the apple leaves that fell down, and that reduced the incidence of apple scab in the following year. So, I think there's an opportunity there to look. Now, if using mixtures, obviously varieties gives you more resilience against what might happen to those in terms of disease. But I think there's a lot of opportunities for integrating agroforestry with a fruit tree system. I mean, very much so, fruit and nut trees. There's quite a few good examples of hazel grown in an agroforestry scenario, which works well. And there's opportunities there too. Yeah.
And then my final question, I'm going to stop then, is Shropshire sheep, is it? That is supposed to be really good for grazing?
Yeah, there's a lot of evidence, published evidence in England. There aren't so many sheep here, but a few of the apple growers in around Loughgall have Shropshire sheep. They don't touch the trees. Christmas tree growers use them particularly because they can grow their Christmas tree and they can graze around those with sheep that keep the grass down. And it's definitely proven that they are a good breed, but they cost a small fortune. That's the trouble.
We'll have to start breeding them, Jim, I think.
I have to start breeding them, yes. There's a market there.
Okay, thanks a million, Jim.